The elevator game, riding between dimensions. There's a game that circulates through online communities and urban legend exchanges. Instructions that claim if you follow a specific sequence of button presses in a particular type of elevator. A building with at least 10 floors, riding alone, performing a precise ritual of ascending and descending in a pattern that makes no practical sense. You can access an alternate dimension, a parallel version of reality that exists alongside our own, but that's normally inaccessible, separated by barriers that the elevator game somehow allows you to breach. The instructions are specific. Enter the elevator alone. Press the buttons in sequence. 4th floor, 2nd floor, 6th floor, 2nd floor again, 10th floor. And when you reach the 10th floor, don't exit even if someone enters. And if a woman enters on the 10th floor, whatever you do, don't look at her, don't speak to her, don't acknowledge her presence because she isn't human. She's something else, a guardian or entity that exists at the threshold between dimensions. If she speaks to you, remain silent. If she doesn't enter, or if you successfully ignore her, press the button for the 5th floor. And if the elevator goes up instead of down, if it ascends past the 10th floor to somewhere that shouldn't exist, you've succeeded in crossing over to the other world. The alternate dimension where everything looks almost like our reality, but wrong. Empty, red-tinted, where you might be the only person, where electronics don't work properly, where the rules are different, and where leaving requires performing the ritual in reverse. If you can find an elevator that still functions, if the woman doesn't prevent you, if you remember the sequence correctly, if the dimension allows you to leave at all. Hundreds of people claim to have played the elevator game, some reporting that nothing happened, that they rode elevators pressing random buttons and felt foolish for believing internet legends. But others claiming they did cross over, that they experienced the other world briefly before fleeing back, and a very few claiming they went too far, stayed too long, encountered things in that empty red world that they won't describe, but that left them changed, that made them understand. The elevator game isn't game at all, but is genuine doorway to somewhere we're not supposed to go, somewhere that exists parallel to our reality, accessible through this bizarre elevator ritual that sounds like creepypasta nonsense until you try it and discover that maybe, impossibly, the instructions actually work, that elevators can be portals, that dimensional travel is possible through precise manipulation of architectural spaces that weren't designed for this purpose, but that somehow, under specific conditions, with specific sequences, allow crossing between worlds that normally remain separate, leaving players with the choice of whether to believe the warnings, whether to attempt the ritual, whether to risk encountering the woman on the 10th floor, and discovering whether the other world is real, or whether the elevator game is just another urban legend, another internet myth that preys on human desire to believe that magic and mystery still exist, that hidden dimensions wait behind the mundane architecture of apartment buildings and hotels, accessible to anyone brave or foolish enough to ride alone through the sequence, through the pattern that either opens doorways between realities or just makes you look absurd, pushing elevator buttons in strange order, depending on whether the game works, whether the other dimension exists, whether the woman is real, and whether you're willing to find out. The elevator game appears to have originated in South Korea, circulating in online communities as El Ribiteo Game, before spreading internationally through creepypasta sites, Reddit threads, YouTube videos, and other platforms where urban legends and ritual games propagate. The Korean origin is significant because elevator-related supernatural beliefs are particularly strong in East Asian cultures, where elevators and other liminal transitional spaces are often associated with spiritual activity, where the boundary between floors or levels is seen as threshold where different realms can touch, where spirits can enter our world, or where humans can accidentally cross into spirit realms. The specificity of the instructions gives the ritual an air of authenticity, as if these are genuine directions for a real phenomenon rather than fictional elements of a story. The exact button sequence, 4th, 2nd, 6th, 2nd, 10th, has variations across different versions of the game, but the core structure remains consistent. A pattern that requires moving between floors in a sequence that makes no practical sense, that would be inefficient for any normal elevator use, that serves no purpose except as ritual, as formula, as the specific combination that allegedly opens the doorway. The woman who appears on the 10th floor is described consistently across accounts as wearing dark clothing, having long dark hair covering her face, emanating a sense of wrongness or danger that makes players instinctively want to leave the elevator immediately. She's identified in some versions as not being from our dimension, as being a guardian or test, as something that players must resist interacting with to proceed further. The specific warning not to look at her, not to speak to her, parallels folklore from multiple cultures about encounters with supernatural entities where acknowledgement or interaction creates connection or danger, where ignoring the entity is the safest response, even though every instinct screams to react to someone entering your elevator. The detail that the elevator will ascend when you press the 5th floor button, going up instead of down despite being on the 10th floor, is the moment that supposedly indicates successful dimensional crossing. An elevator ascending from the top floor violates the physical constraint that should prevent it, suggesting you've left normal space-time where the 10th floor is the highest point, and entered a space where the elevator can go beyond the building's actual structure, where architectural limits no longer apply because you're no longer in the architecture you started in, but rather in its dimensional reflection or alternate version. The other world is described as red-tinted or lit by red light, as being mostly empty of people, as having familiar architecture but wrong atmosphere, as a place where you might see distant lights or shapes, but no actual people, or where the only other person you encounter is the woman who has followed you or who exists in both dimensions. Electronics are said to malfunction, phones don't work, cameras fail, the normal connections to the wider world are severed, leaving you isolated in this alternate space with no way to call for help or document what you're experiencing. The escape instructions involve returning to the elevator, pressing the button sequence in reverse, or in a different pattern that supposedly returns you to normal reality, assuming you can find an elevator that operates, assuming you remember the sequence, assuming the dimension allows you to leave. Some versions warn that you must leave before a certain time limit, that staying too long causes you to become stuck, unable to return, trapped in the empty alternate world permanently. Others warn that the woman will try to prevent your departure, will appear in the elevator, will speak or touch you, to create connection that anchors you to the alternate dimension and prevents return. The documented attempts are numerous but difficult to verify. YouTube contains countless videos of people claiming to attempt the elevator game. Though most show nothing unusual, people pressing buttons, riding elevators, experiencing normal elevator behavior, sometimes claiming they felt strange or scared, but without any objective documentation of dimensional crossing. The handful of videos that show unusual events, elevator lights flickering, strange sounds, the elevator moving in unexpected ways, are ambiguous, potentially explainable through normal elevator malfunction or through video editing and hoaxing. The compelling accounts come from text-based stories shared in paranormal communities, detailed first-person narratives of people who claim they performed the ritual and experienced the crossing, who describe the red-tinted world, the emptiness, the overwhelming desire to leave immediately, the terror of being alone in a dimension that looks almost like home, but that's fundamentally wrong. These narratives are effective horror writing regardless of their truth status, creating visceral sense of wrongness and isolation that resonates psychologically. even if the events described never actually occurred. The question of whether anyone has actually crossed dimensions through the elevator game versus whether people have experienced psychological states that they interpreted as dimensional crossing is central. Elevators are inherently disorienting spaces, enclosed, moving, with limited sensory input, designed to be transitional and temporary. Performing a ritual in an elevator, focusing attention on buttons and floors, and watching for anomalies creates heightened state of awareness and anxiety that could produce perceptual distortions, could make normal elevator behavior seem strange or significant, could generate strong emotions and experiences that feel real, even if they're purely psychological. The ritual elements create self-fulfilling prophecy potential. If you believe the game works, if you're nervous and hyper-alert while performing it, if you're primed to interpret any unusual sensation as evidence of dimensional crossing, your perception and memory can construct experiences that seem to validate the belief. The woman on the 10th floor might be any person who happens to enter at that point, transformed in memory and perception into the supernatural entity the ritual describes. The red tinting might be perceptual artifact of stress and reduced oxygen in enclosed space, or might be suggestion creating visual experience that isn't externally real, but that feels genuine to the experiencer. But this psychological explanation, while plausible, doesn't account for the specific consistency across reports, the particular details that appear in independent accounts. The fact that people attempting the game without believing in it sometimes report unusual experiences that disturb them enough to share despite their skepticism. Either the psychological effects of the ritual are powerful enough to produce consistent hallucinatory or perceptual phenomena across different individuals, or something else is happening that we don't have framework for explaining. The dimensional travel hypothesis takes the game literally, proposes that elevators under specific conditions and through specific manipulation can create portals or interfaces with parallel dimensions. This would require physics far beyond current understanding, would require that dimensions exist adjacent to ours in ways that architectural spaces can bridge, would require that human intention or ritual can affect dimensional barriers, creating access where normally none exists. The mechanism by which pressing elevator buttons in sequence would open dimensional doorways isn't specified and isn't apparent from any known physics, making this explanation scientifically untenable but narratively compelling. The tulpa or egregore interpretation suggests that the elevator game has become real through collective belief, that the thousands of people who know about it and think about it and attempt it have created genuine phenomenon through focused attention and expectation, manifesting the woman and the alternate dimension through the power of shared mental energy, or through mechanisms of consciousness that materialism doesn't acknowledge. In this framework, the game works now because enough people believe it works, regardless of whether it worked originally, or whether it was ever intended to be real rather than fiction. The dangers, if real, are emphasized in the warnings that accompany the instructions. Players are cautioned to ensure they can complete the ritual, to not stay in the alternate dimension longer than necessary, to avoid the woman at all costs, to follow the return sequence exactly, to be prepared for the possibility that return might not be possible. These warnings serve narrative functions, building tension, creating stakes, making the game feel consequential. But they also serve protective functions if the phenomenon is real, warning off casual attempts while providing safety guidelines for those determined to try. The comparison to other ritual games is inevitable. Bloody Mary, the Midnight Man, the Three Kings, and numerous other ritual practices that circulate through youth culture and online communities share characteristics with the elevator game: specific instructions, alleged supernatural results, warnings about dangers, mix of believers and skeptics, and difficulty determining whether any of it is real versus purely psychological or fictional. These games serve social functions, create shared experiences, test courage, provide frameworks for exploring fear and mystery, whether or not they produce genuine supernatural effects. The liminal space aspect is central. Elevators are quintessentially liminal, spaces of transition, neither here nor there, between floors, between destinations, temporary enclosures where normal social rules are suspended and where strangers are forced into uncomfortable proximity. This liminality makes them psychologically potent, makes them feel like spaces where unusual things might happen, where normal reality might be less stable. The elevator game exploits this existing psychological association, using the inherent strangeness of elevator space to create ritual that feels like it should work, that feels appropriate to the space it utilizes. The persistence and spread of the game demonstrate its cultural resonance. It continues to circulate years after first appearing, continues to attract new participants, continues to generate reports and discussions and warnings. This persistence suggests it's serving psychological or social needs. Need for mystery, for experiences that transcend mundane reality, for shared cultural practices that create bonds and stories, for testing personal courage against alleged supernatural threats. Whether the game actually produces dimensional crossing becomes almost secondary to its function as cultural practice, as shared mythology that gives meaning and structure to elevator-related anxiety and liminal space discomfort. The question of whether you should attempt the elevator game, if you're curious, ultimately depends on what you believe and what you're looking for. If you're seeking verifiable proof of dimensional travel, you're unlikely to find it. The experiences reported are subjective and ambiguous, not producing physical evidence that could convince skeptics. If you're seeking personal experience of mystery and fear, the ritual might provide that regardless of whether anything supernatural occurs, purely through the psychological effects of performing the ritual in isolation, of focusing attention on possibility of the uncanny, of creating conditions where perceptual anomalies feel significant. The elevator game exists in the space between real and fictional, between psychological and supernatural, between cultural practice and genuine phenomenon. It might be nothing more than creepypasta that's been taken seriously by people who want to believe in accessible magic and hidden dimensions. It might be psychological exercise that produces powerful subjective experiences through ritual and suggestion without anything objectively unusual occurring. Or it might be, impossibly, what it claims to be: actual technique for accessing alternate dimensions through elevator manipulation, doorway, hidden in plain sight, ritual that works for reasons we don't understand, through mechanisms we don't possess frameworks for analyzing, making the woman on the 10th floor real, making the red world real, making dimensional travel possible for anyone willing to ride alone through the sequence and risk discovering that the warnings were accurate, that some games aren't games, that some rituals produce real effects, and that elevators designed merely to move people between floors can, under specific conditions, become something else entirely, become portals, become thresholds, become access points to dimensions that exist parallel to our own, waiting behind the architecture, accessible through the pattern, through the ritual, through the elevator game that thousands have attempted and that remains forever ambiguous, forever uncertain, forever hovering between elaborate hoax and genuine mystery, between psychological phenomenon and dimensional doorway, between creepypasta and reality, leaving players to decide for themselves whether to press the buttons, whether to ride alone through the sequence, whether to find out if the woman appears, whether to discover if the elevator ascends when it should descend, whether to learn if the other world is real, or if they'll simply ride a normal elevator, pressing random buttons while feeling foolish for believing internet legends about dimensional travel through elevator ritual, about games that aren't games, about architectural spaces that become portals, about the woman on the 10th floor who guards the threshold, about the red world waiting just beyond normal reality, accessible allegedly through this bizarre sequence of button presses that either opens doorways between dimensions or does absolutely nothing except waste time and make you look strange to anyone watching elevator security cameras, leaving the elevator game as it is and as it will likely remain: popular, persistent, disturbing, compelling, unverified, ambiguous, possibly real, and possibly fictional. Definitely effective at generating experiences that people interpret as significant whether or not anything supernatural actually occurred, making it perfect modern urban legend, perfect internet age myth, perfect liminal space ritual that exploits elevator psychology and dimensional possibility and human desire to believe that hidden worlds exist and that access requires only knowledge of the sequence, only willingness to ride alone, only courage to face the woman if she appears, and to enter the red world if the elevator ascends. Discovering finally whether the elevator game works, or whether it was always just story, always just legend, always just another creepypasta that people wanted to believe in badly enough that they convinced themselves it was real, riding elevators, pressing buttons in strange patterns, searching for dimensional doorways that either exist or don't, that either open or don't, that either lead to alternate realities or lead only to disappointment, and the realization that not every ritual produces magic, that not every legend describes truth, that sometimes elevators are just elevators, and button sequences are just button sequences, and the woman never appears because she was never real, and the other world doesn't exist because dimensions don't work that way. And the elevator game is simply game, simply fiction, simply one more way. Humans try to inject mystery into mundane architecture, to find portals in ordinary spaces, to believe that somewhere, somehow, just beyond the normal world, alternate dimensions wait, accessible to anyone who knows the pattern, who performs the ritual, who plays the elevator game, and discovers whether it works or whether they've been fooled by internet legend into pressing random buttons alone in elevators, hoping for dimensional travel that never comes. That was never possible. That exists only in stories and in the perpetual human hope that maybe this time, this ritual, this sequence, this elevator will be different, will open the doorway, will prove the legend true, will take them to the other world where the rules change and reality becomes fluid, and nothing is quite what it seems. The red world, the empty world, the alternate dimension that might be real or might be fiction, but that remains forever accessible in imagination. And perhaps, just perhaps, through the elevator game, through the sequence, through the ritual that continues to spread and continues to be attempted, and continues to generate experiences that people interpret as proof or as delusion depending on their frameworks and their beliefs, and whether they think dimensional travel through elevator manipulation is possible or impossible, leaving the question open, leaving the game available, leaving the instructions circulating through internet communities, where they'll continue to find new players, new believers, new skeptics, new people willing to ride alone through the sequence to discover for themselves whether elevators can be portals, whether dimensions can be crossed, whether the woman is real, whether the other world exists, whether the elevator game is genuine doorway, or elaborate fiction that convinced thousands of people to press buttons in strange patterns while hoping for magic that never manifests, that was never there, that might never have been real except in the collective imagination where the elevator game lives permanently. Accessible to all, verifiable by none, existing in perpetual uncertainty between urban legend and hidden truth. The Hat Man, a shadow figure seen across all cultures. He appears at the foot of your bed in the deepest hours of night, a silhouette darker than the surrounding darkness, wearing what looks unmistakably like a wide-brimmed hat, and sometimes a long coat or cloak. He doesn't move, doesn't speak, just stands there watching with attention that feels malevolent and ancient, radiating a presence so oppressive that breathing becomes difficult and moving is impossible. You're awake but paralyzed, conscious but helpless, aware that something profoundly wrong is in your bedroom, and there's nothing you can do except endure its scrutiny until it decides to leave or fade away. This is the Hat Man, and he's been appearing to people across every continent, every culture, every demographic for decades at minimum, and possibly for centuries. Witnesses who've never heard of each other describe him in identical terms. The hat, the watching, the overwhelming dread, the sense that this isn't human and never was, that you're being observed by something that exists outside normal reality, something that studies humans the way we might study insects, with detached curiosity mixed with something darker that none of the witnesses can articulate. But all of them feel with absolute certainty when they see that silhouette standing motionless in their darkened room. The consistency of descriptions across independent witnesses is what elevates the Hat Man from random nightmare into genuine phenomenon. People who've never researched shadow figures, who've never read horror stories or paranormal accounts, wake up and see this entity. And when they later search online trying to understand what happened to them, they discover thousands of reports describing exactly what they saw. The wide-brimmed hat that looks like something from the Old West or vintage detective films. The long coat or cape. The absolute blackness of the figure that seems to absorb light rather than merely blocking it. The sense of three-dimensional presence despite being composed entirely of shadow. The hat is the signature element, the detail that transforms shadow person into specifically the Hat Man, and its consistency across cultures that have different historical relationships with hats and different fashion contexts makes its uniformity even stranger. Most encounters occur during sleep paralysis, the state where consciousness returns before the body's motor control reactivates, leaving you awake and aware but unable to move or speak. Sleep paralysis is well documented medically, a glitch in the mechanisms that prevent us from physically acting out dreams. And it frequently includes hallucinations. Seeing figures in the room, feeling pressure on the chest, sensing malevolent presence. The standard medical explanation for the Hat Man is that he's a cultural archetype, a shared image that appears during these vulnerable states because our brains are pattern-seeking and construct threatening figures from ambiguous sensory input when we're paralyzed and frightened. Different cultures see different entities during sleep paralysis based on their mythologies. Old hags, demons, aliens, shadow people. And the Hat Man is simply the Western contemporary version, an amalgamation of film noir, detectives, gunslinger imagery, and Grim Reaper aesthetics, producing a figure that feels archetypal and threatening. But this explanation struggles with the cross-cultural consistency. The Hat Man appears in countries where fedoras and wide-brimmed hats aren't culturally significant. To children too young to have absorbed film noir aesthetics, to people in remote areas with limited media exposure who wouldn't have access to the shared cultural database that supposedly creates his image. A child in rural Indonesia describes the same figure as a college student in Ohio. An elderly woman in Norway sees the same silhouette as a teenager in Brazil. The hat and coat aren't universal symbols of menace. They're specific to certain Western time periods and genres. Yet the Hat Man transcends these boundaries, appearing identically to people who have no reason to generate that specific image from their cultural programming. The Hat Man doesn't always appear during sleep paralysis. Some witnesses report seeing him while fully awake and mobile, standing in hallways, visible in peripheral vision, watching from corners or doorways before vanishing when looked at directly. These daytime sightings lack the paralysis element that skeptics use to explain him as hallucination, yet the figure remains consistent: the hat, the coat, the darkness, the watching. He's been photographed in a handful of cases, or at least dark anomalies in photos have been interpreted as possibly being him, though like all paranormal photography, the images are ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations and definitive enough to convince those who already believe. The emotional impact of encountering the Hat Man is severe and consistent. Witnesses describe terror that exceeds normal fear, a primal dread that suggests encountering something fundamentally wrong, something that violates basic assumptions about what should exist. Many report the fear lingering for days or weeks after the encounter, disrupting sleep, creating anxiety about entering bedrooms or being in darkness. Some develop insomnia, afraid to sleep because sleep might bring him back. Others report recurring encounters, as if once he's appeared, he continues returning, as if being noticed by him creates a connection that persists beyond the initial sighting. The sense of being studied is what many witnesses emphasize most strongly. He's not attacking, not threatening in any overt way, but his attention feels predatory and violating. You're being assessed, examined, cataloged. He's there for a purpose that relates to you, but that he'll never explain, and his complete stillness and silence make the experience more disturbing than active menace would. It's the patience of something that exists outside human timescales, that can stand and watch for as long as it wants, because it doesn't get tired, doesn't get bored, doesn't operate according to human limitations. The watching implies intelligence, consciousness, intention. This isn't random atmospheric manifestation, but an entity with agency who's chosen to appear and observe you specifically. Theories about what the Hat Man actually is span the full range of paranormal frameworks. In supernatural interpretations, he's a demon or malevolent spirit, something ancient that predates humanity, that feeds on fear or negative emotions and manifests during sleep paralysis, because that state makes humans particularly vulnerable to psychic or spiritual intrusion. The hat and coat might be adopted affectations, appearance elements he wears, because they increase fear in modern humans, or they might be his actual form as perceived through the filter of human visual processing. Our brains translating something that doesn't have physical form into the closest visual analog we can construct. Jungian psychology might interpret him as a shadow archetype, the collective unconscious manifesting as an external figure during altered states of consciousness. The hat marks him as other, as not belonging to the immediate time and space, as something from outside that's intruding into the personal sanctuary of the bedroom. He represents death, threat, the unknown, all the aspects of existence that consciousness tries to exclude, but that lurk always at the edges. During sleep paralysis, when the normal barriers between conscious and unconscious are compromised, he breaks through, becomes visible, manifests as external entity, even though he might originate from the deepest layers of human psyche. Interdimensional theories propose he's a being from parallel reality or adjacent dimension, something that exists in spaces that overlap with ours, but aren't normally accessible to human perception. Sleep paralysis or certain states of consciousness might temporarily thin the barriers, allowing us to see into dimensions that coexist with ours, and the Hat Man is a resident of those spaces who becomes visible during these moments of overlap. He's always there, always watching, but only sometimes visible when conditions allow cross-dimensional perception. The hat and coat might be his actual appearance, or might be how our visual cortex interprets sensory data from an entity that doesn't properly translate into our dimensional physics. There are also theories connecting him to alien abduction phenomena, suggesting he's a screen memory or camouflage used by non-human intelligences during encounters they don't want remembered clearly. The paralysis, the bedroom setting, the sense of being examined, these match abduction accounts. Perhaps what people interpret as the Hat Man is actually alien entities conducting observations or procedures, with the Hat Man image serving as psychological cover, a less technologically threatening figure that human minds construct to replace memories of the actual encounter that would be too traumatic or too revealing to consciously process. The association with death and dying is strong in Hat Man lore. Some witnesses report seeing him around times of personal crisis, illness, or when death enters their life through loss of loved ones. He's been interpreted as a psychopomp, a being who appears when the barrier between life and death thins, who watches those who are approaching transition, or who are emotionally close to someone who is. In this framework, he's not necessarily malevolent, but rather performing a function related to mortality, observing, and perhaps recording or guiding. His appearance a harbinger that death is near, even if not imminent. The fear he generates might be instinctive human response to confronting something that represents or heralds our eventual fate. Children see the Hat Man with disturbing frequency, and their descriptions match adult accounts despite children having less cultural baggage and fewer preconceived notions about what shadow figures should look like. A 5-year-old describing a tall, dark man with a big hat watching from the doorway is chilling precisely because that child probably hasn't been exposed to film noir or Western archetypes that would program that specific image. Either children are particularly sensitive to whatever the Hat Man is, or the image is so fundamental to human consciousness that even young children generate it identically to adults when conditions allow him to manifest. Geographic clustering sometimes occurs, with multiple people in the same area reporting Hat Man encounters within short time periods, suggesting either localized conditions that facilitate his appearance or that he targets specific locations for reasons we can't determine. Houses where he's been seen sometimes have histories of other paranormal activity, or reports of feeling watched or unwelcome. Whether the Hat Man causes or is attracted to these atmospheres, or whether psychologically sensitive individuals who live in disturbing environments are more likely to experience the sleep paralysis conditions during which he appears, remains unclear. The technology angle is explored by some researchers who note that Hat Man sightings seem to have increased with the proliferation of electronic devices and electromagnetic fields in homes. EMF exposure has been linked to unusual neurological effects, including hallucinations, and some theorize that sleeping surrounded by electronics creates fields that interact with brain function in ways that produce consistent hallucinations. But this doesn't explain Hat Man sightings from before the electronic age. Historical accounts that describe similar figures in times when EMF exposure was minimal or non-existent, suggesting the phenomenon predates modern technology, even if technology might be making it more frequent. Encounters often include physical sensations beyond paralysis, pressure on the chest as if something is sitting or standing on you, difficulty breathing, coldness in the room that doesn't match the temperature, sensation of being touched or probed when nothing visible is making contact. These physical elements make the experience harder to dismiss as purely visual hallucination. The body is responding to something, whether that's neurological misfiring during sleep paralysis or actual presence that affects physical space and biology in measurable ways. Those who experience recurring visits from the Hat Man report that encounters sometimes escalate. The figure moves closer over successive appearances, or the sense of malevolence intensifies. or the paralysis lasts longer. Some witnesses describe developing a relationship with him, not friendly, but familiar and cyclical, as if he returns periodically to check on them for reasons that remain opaque. Others report that after initial encounters, they become sensitive to shadow figures in general, seeing multiple types of shadow entities where they previously saw none, as if the Hat Man's initial appearance opened their perception to an entire category of beings that exist alongside human reality. The question of why he wears a hat is strangely significant. Hats signify identity, profession, status in human culture. The wide-brimmed style he's consistently described wearing evokes specific archetypes: the Old West gunslinger, the private detective, the mysterious stranger. These are figures of authority, threat, justice, or judgment. Is the hat his actual appearance, or is it signaling something about his role or nature? Does he wear it to be more recognizable to human consciousness, to trigger specific associations and emotions? Or is it coincidence that what he is happens to resemble what humans interpret as a hat? Our brains taking something whose actual form we can't process and translating it into familiar objects. Skeptics point to the simple fact that tall, dark, humanoid shapes are naturally threatening to humans because they resemble predators or hostile humans, and adding a hat-like element at the top creates a more complete and therefore more frightening figure. During sleep paralysis, when the brain is hallucinating threats, it constructs the most effective fear stimulus it can generate, and a tall, dark, watching figure with distinctive headwear that makes it feel intelligent and intentional is remarkably effective at triggering terror. The consistency across cultures might reflect universal human psychology, rather than a genuinely external entity. We all have similar brains that produce similar hallucinations under similar conditions of paralysis and fear. But for those who've encountered him, these explanations feel inadequate to capture the actual experience. The presence isn't vague or dreamlike. It's absolutely concrete, more real than dreams, as present as any physical person in the room. The details aren't fuzzy or uncertain. The hat, the watching, the malevolence are crystal clear. And the aftermath isn't like waking from a nightmare where relief comes quickly. It's lasting disturbance, persistent sense that something was genuinely there, that you've been noticed by something that continues to exist, whether you're aware of it or not. The Hat Man has entered popular culture sufficiently that he's recognized in creepypasta communities, horror fiction, paranormal discussion boards. This creates feedback where awareness potentially influences experience. People who know about the Hat Man might be more likely to interpret ambiguous experiences as encounters with him. But the phenomenon existed before internet communities gave it a name, documented in older accounts where people described the figure without having a cultural reference for what they were seeing. The modern naming and sharing might be amplifying the phenomenon, but the core experience appears to predate its internet fame. What remains undeniable is that across the world, independent of cultural background or exposure to paranormal media, people wake up paralyzed and see the same figure. Tall, dark, wearing a distinctive hat, standing and watching with attention that feels ancient and wrong. Whether he's a demon feeding on fear, a dimensional traveler observing humans during moments when barriers thin, an alien using disguise to obscure abduction procedures, a psychological archetype manifesting during altered consciousness, or something else entirely that doesn't fit into any category we've conceived, the Hat Man persists. He appears in bedrooms and hallways, at the foot of beds and in doorways, always watching, always silent, always wearing that unmistakable hat that makes him instantly recognizable to anyone who's seen him and makes every testimony about him ring with disturbing consistency. And somewhere tonight, in the darkest hours when sleep paralysis grips someone between waking and dreaming, he'll appear again. a figure darker than shadow, wearing a hat that shouldn't make him more identifiable, but somehow does, standing absolutely motionless while radiating presence and intent that paralyze more thoroughly than the physiological mechanisms that have locked the victim's muscles. He'll watch with attention that feels like assessment, like cataloging, like something fundamental about the witness is being recorded or measured. And in the morning, when mobility returns and normal consciousness resumes, that person will search online trying to understand what they saw. And they'll discover thousands of accounts describing exactly the same figure, the same hat, the same watching, the same terror. They'll realize they're not alone, that the Hat Man has been appearing to people everywhere, that whatever he is has been studying humanity for reasons we'll never know unless he decides to communicate, and that being seen by him creates a connection that might bring him back night after night, standing in the darkness, wearing his distinctive hat, watching, always watching, waiting for something we can't understand with patience that suggests he has all the time in the world, and we have only the terrifying moments of paralysis during which we're helpless to do anything except stare back and wonder what he sees when he looks at us, what he wants, and whether being noticed by something from outside our reality is a violation we'll carry forever, marked somehow by his attention, forever aware that in the darkness at the edge of vision, the Hat Man might be standing there even now, even in daylight, even when we're not paralyzed, watching from places we can't quite see with interest that will never be explained. The mysterious death of Elisa Lam at the Cecil Hotel. In February 2013, the body of 21-year-old Elisa Lam was discovered in one of the rooftop water tanks of the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, found only after guests complained about discolored water and low water pressure, leading maintenance workers to investigate and discover Elisa's naked body floating in the tank, where it had been decomposing for as long as 19 days, explaining the water complaints, but raising immediate questions about how she had gotten into the tank in the first place, why she was in there, how she had accessed the locked roof, how she had climbed into a water tank that required a ladder to reach and was difficult to enter even intentionally, and why her death was there, in that specific tank, in that specific hotel, the Cecil Hotel, a location with such a dark history of violence, death, and serial killer associations that it had become infamous as one of Los Angeles' most sinister addresses, a place where Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, had stayed during his killing spree, where serial killer Jack Unterweger had stayed while murdering prostitutes, where countless suicides and deaths had occurred over decades of operating as Skid Row Flophouse, making the Cecil a location already heavy with death before Elisa Lam arrived, and making her death there feel less like random tragedy and more like the hotel claiming another victim, another life added to its grim tally. But what made Elisa Lam's death transcend typical mysterious death and become internet phenomenon, become the subject of endless speculation and investigation and conspiracy theories, was the elevator surveillance footage released by police showing Elisa's behavior shortly before her disappearance. 4 minutes of extremely strange activity where she enters the elevator, presses multiple buttons, stands in the corner, then steps in and out repeatedly, appears to be hiding from someone or something, gestures strangely with her hands as if communicating or performing some ritual, peers out into the hallway as if checking for someone, and exhibits behavior that seems either profoundly disturbed, influenced by drugs or mental illness, or terrified of something or someone that isn't visible in the footage, creating video that's deeply unsettling to watch, that has been analyzed frame by frame by thousands of internet sleuths, that has generated theories ranging from mental health crisis to paranormal activity to murder cover-up, making Elisa Lam's death a perfect storm of mysterious circumstances disturbing footage, sinister location, and ambiguous official conclusion that leaves room for doubt, room for alternate theories, room for the suspicion that something more happened than the official explanation of accidental drowning, complicated by bipolar disorder. Acknowledges, leaving Elisa Lam's death as it remains, over a decade later, officially explained but not definitively resolved, concluded by authorities but questioned by observers, understood as tragic accident by some and as unsolved mystery by others, with the elevator footage standing as permanent testament to her final known movements, to her apparent distress or confusion, to behavior that demands explanation but that resists simple interpretation, making her death one of the internet age's most discussed and debated mysterious deaths, one where video evidence exists but only deepens rather than resolves the mystery, where we can watch her but still don't understand what happened to her, where the footage creates as many questions as it answers, leaving Elisa Lam's death suspended between explanation and mystery, between mental health tragedy and something darker, between accident and possible foul play, between what the authorities concluded and what internet investigators continue to question, with the water tank and the elevator footage and the Cecil Hotel's dark history combining into a narrative that resists closure, that generates endless speculation, that transforms a young woman's tragic death into internet phenomenon, into true crime obsession, into mystery that persists despite official conclusions. Because the details don't quite fit. The behavior in the footage doesn't quite make sense. The access to the water tank seems too difficult. The circumstances seem too strange to be mere accident, leaving Elisa Lam's death as permanent question, permanent mystery, permanent tragedy that happened at the Cecil Hotel, in circumstances that remain disturbing, remain unexplained to many observers' satisfaction, remain the subject of documentaries and investigations, and endless internet discussion about what really happened to Elisa Lam. The official investigation concluded that Elisa's death was accidental drowning, with her bipolar disorder listed as a significant contributing factor. The coroner found no evidence of physical trauma, no signs of assault, no drugs or alcohol in her system beyond her prescribed psychiatric medications, which she appeared to have stopped taking regularly in the days or weeks before her death, based on toxicology showing lower than therapeutic levels. The conclusion was that Elisa, experiencing a mental health crisis possibly exacerbated by medication noncompliance, accessed the roof of the hotel, climbed into the water tank, perhaps seeking a place to hide, or perhaps in a confused state, not understanding the danger, and then couldn't get out once inside, dying of drowning with her body remaining undiscovered for up to 19 days until the water quality issues prompted investigation. This explanation accounts for the basic facts, but struggles with several logistical problems. The roof access should have been locked and alarmed, requiring either that Elisa found a way to bypass security, that the alarm wasn't functioning, or that she accessed the roof through a route that didn't trigger alarms. The water tank itself was difficult to access, requiring climbing a ladder and then lifting or removing a heavy lid that was on top of the tank. For someone in a mental health crisis to accomplish this alone seems challenging, though not impossible, particularly if adrenaline and altered mental state provided unusual strength or determination. The nakedness is explained as possibly resulting from paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where hypothermic or confused individuals remove clothing. Though Elisa wouldn't have been hypothermic in Los Angeles in February, raising questions about whether this explanation applies. Alternatively, she might have undressed while in the tank for reasons related to her mental state, or her clothing might have come off during her time in the water. Her belongings, including clothing, were found on the roof near the tank, supporting the theory that she undressed before or while entering the tank. The elevator footage is what most troubles observers. Elisa's behavior seems extremely unusual. The repeated entering and exiting, the hiding in the corner, the strange hand gestures, the apparent fear or confusion. Mental health advocates note that this behavior is consistent with severe mental health crisis, possibly psychosis associated with bipolar disorder, particularly if she was unmedicated or experiencing a manic or mixed episode. The gestures might be response to hallucinations. The hiding might reflect paranoid delusions about being followed or threatened. The repeated button pressing might be compulsive behavior, or confusion about how the elevator operates. But other observers see the behavior as suggesting someone was pursuing her, that she was hiding from a real threat rather than from hallucinations, that her gestures might have been trying to signal distress to someone, that her behavior indicates genuine fear rather than psychotic episode. The fact that the elevator door stays open for extended periods during the footage, far longer than it should remain open, has sparked theories about someone holding it from outside the camera frame, though technical explanations suggest the elevator might have been malfunctioning or in service mode. The hotel's security measures and surveillance gaps are significant. The Cecil had cameras in some areas, but not others, creating blind spots where activity wouldn't be recorded. The roof access wasn't continuously monitored by camera, meaning we don't have footage of how Elisa accessed the roof or how she got into the water tank. This absence of complete surveillance creates space for alternate theories. If we could see the roof access and water tank approach, many questions would be answered, but without that footage, we're left with speculation about how a young woman in crisis navigated security measures and accessed a location that should have been restricted. The timing of discovery is disturbing primarily because of the water complaints. Guests were unknowingly using water from a tank containing a decomposing body for up to 2 weeks before the body was found. This has no bearing on how Elisa died, but adds a macabre element that has contributed to the case's notoriety and to the Cecil Hotel's reputation as a cursed location. The internet investigation that emerged around the case represents one of the earliest examples of crowdsourced true crime investigation, with thousands of people analyzing the elevator footage frame by frame, researching Elisa's social media and blog posts, looking for clues about her mental state or her plans, developing theories about everything from serial killer involvement to paranormal activity, to government conspiracy to tuberculosis test coincidence. The last referring to the fact that a TB test is called Lam Elisa, sharing Elisa Lam's name reversed, which led to wild speculation about her death being connected to a tuberculosis outbreak near Skid Row, though this appears to be tragic coincidence rather than meaningful connection. The harm caused by internet investigation in this case is significant. Elisa's family's grief was compounded by online speculation and conspiracy theories. Individuals who appeared in the hotel's surveillance footage, or who were near the hotel, were accused of involvement without evidence. Their lives disrupted by false accusations from online investigators, convinced they'd identified a suspect. The case demonstrates both the power and the danger of crowdsourced investigation, the power to bring attention to cases and to generate new investigative angles, but the danger of false accusations, conspiracy theory amplification, and the transformation of tragedy into entertainment. The Cecil Hotel's history contributed significantly to suspicion around Elisa's death. The hotel had been site of multiple murders, suicides, and unexplained deaths over its nearly century of operation. Beyond the serial killer connections, Ramirez and Unterweger, staying there during their killing sprees, the hotel had been location where people died with disturbing regularity, where violence and drug activity were common, where the transient population and Skid Row location created an atmosphere of danger and instability. This history primed observers to see Elisa's death as potentially sinister rather than accidental, to suspect that the hotel itself or something about the location was responsible, generating theories about curses, about paranormal activity, about the Cecil claiming victims as if it were a malevolent entity, rather than merely building with unfortunate history in challenging neighborhood. The mental health angle is crucial and often insufficiently emphasized in discussion of the case. Elisa had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression, was on medication, and based on her blog posts and social media, appeared to be struggling with her mental health in the period before her death. Her trip to California was solo travel that she'd embarked on despite her parents' concerns, suggesting possible manic episode or elevated mood that gave her confidence to travel alone, despite the risks such travel might pose for someone with unstable mental health. The elevator footage, when viewed through mental health lens rather than through mystery lens, shows someone in crisis experiencing symptoms that could be consistent with psychosis, paranoia, or severe anxiety. Symptoms that people with bipolar disorder can experience during episodes, particularly when unmedicated or undermedicated. The tragedy is that mental health crisis appears to have led to a vulnerable young woman accessing a dangerous location where she died accidentally. And this tragic but explicable death has been transformed by internet culture into mystery that obscures rather than honors her humanity, that treats her death as puzzle to be solved rather than as a person's life that ended in terrible circumstances. The conspiracy theories and endless speculation can feel disrespectful to Elisa and to her family, reducing her to an enigma, to an unsolved case, to an internet mystery, rather than acknowledging her as a real person who struggled with real mental health challenges that contributed to her death. The lesson extends beyond the specific case to questions about how we discuss mysterious deaths, how we balance legitimate questions and investigation with respect for the deceased and their families, how we distinguish between evidence-based skepticism of official conclusions and baseless conspiracy theories, how we prevent amateur investigation from causing harm, while still acknowledging that sometimes official investigations are incomplete or incorrect, and that outside attention can be valuable. The Elisa Lam case occupies uncertain space where the official explanation is probably correct, but where the circumstances are strange enough that continued questioning doesn't seem entirely unreasonable, creating a situation where some level of speculation feels justified while also creating harm through baseless accusations and disrespectful theorizing. Whether Elisa Lam's death was tragic accident resulting from mental health crisis, whether it was something more sinister that hasn't been adequately investigated, or whether the truth lies somewhere between these positions, accepting the accidental death conclusion while also acknowledging that some questions remain about how exactly she accessed the tank and whether any other parties were involved in ways that weren't determined. The case stands as a reminder that mysterious circumstances don't necessarily indicate mystery that requires exotic explanation, that sometimes the most likely explanation is the correct one even when details seem strange, that mental health crises can lead to behaviors and outcomes that seem inexplicable to observers who don't understand the internal experience of severe psychological distress, and that the internet age has transformed how we engage with true crime and mysterious deaths in ways that can be both illuminating and harmful, both bringing attention to cases that might otherwise be overlooked and generating false theories that cause real damage to real people, leaving Elisa Lam's death as it remains. Officially explained as accidental drowning complicated by mental illness, questioned by many who find that explanation insufficient, memorialized through endless internet discussion that ranges from thoughtful analysis to baseless conspiracy theory, and ultimately understood differently by different observers, depending on whether they trust official conclusions or whether they see the strange circumstances as evidence of something more. whether they view the elevator footage as documenting mental health crisis or as showing someone genuinely being pursued or threatened, whether they accept that sometimes tragic accidents happen in ways that seem improbable, or whether they believe the improbability itself suggests that more investigation is warranted, leaving Elisa Lam's death as permanent fixture of internet true crime discussion, as case that won't be forgotten, because the footage exists, because the circumstances were strange, because the Cecil Hotel's dark history makes any death there seem potentially sinister, and because a young woman died in circumstances that feel like they should have been preventable, that trigger our desire to find explanation beyond accident, beyond mental health crisis, beyond the tragic reality that sometimes people die in ways that seem inexplicable, but that are ultimately the result of illness and circumstance rather than of mystery or malevolence, leaving Elisa Lam's memory caught between being honored as victim of tragic accident and being treated as subject of endless speculation, between being acknowledged as person who struggled with mental health and being reduced to internet mystery, between the explanation that authorities provided and the doubts that observers maintain. Suspended as she was in that water tank, suspended between life and death, suspended between known and unknown, suspended in the permanent, uncertain space where her case remains, explained but questioned, concluded but unresolved, tragic but mysterious. A death at the Cecil Hotel that was either exactly what it appears to be or something else entirely, depending on who's analyzing it, who's discussing it, who's trying to understand what happened to Elisa Lam in February 2013, when she disappeared into the Cecil Hotel's dark history, when she climbed into a water tank for reasons we can only infer, when she died in circumstances that official investigation concluded were accidental. But that continued to trouble observers who watch that elevator footage and see behavior that demands explanation. That suggests something more happened than simple mental health crisis, or who accept the mental health explanation, but still feel profound sadness that a young woman experiencing crisis ended up alone on a roof, alone in a water tank, alone in her final moments in ways that feel like failure. Failure of mental health systems, failure of hotel security, failure of circumstances to align in ways that might have saved her, leaving her death as permanent tragedy, permanent mystery, permanent case that internet age has made impossible to forget, that surveillance footage has made impossible to ignore, that strange circumstances have made impossible to explain to everyone's satisfaction, leaving Elisa Lam's death as it will likely always remain. A tragedy that official investigation concluded was accidental, but that observers continued to question, continued to analyze, continued to discuss, making her one of the most discussed deaths of the internet era. One where we have footage of her final known moments, but where that footage only deepens the mystery, only increases the questions, only makes us wonder what was happening in those 4 minutes in the elevator, what she was afraid of, what she was trying to communicate, what happened to her in the hours after that footage, when she somehow accessed the roof and climbed into a water tank where she would die, and where her body would remain for weeks before being discovered, leaving Elisa Lam's death as permanent question about what happened at the Cecil Hotel, about what took a young woman's life in circumstances that remain disturbing, remain unexplained to many, remain the subject of endless speculation that has transformed her death into mystery that persists, that endures, that makes the Cecil Hotel even more infamous than it was before, makes Elisa Lam's name synonymous with internet age mysterious death, makes her case the example of how surveillance footage can document but not explain, can show us what happened but not why, can create evidence that generates more questions than answers, leaving us with the footage, with the water tank, with the questions, with the tragedy of a young woman who died at 21. In circumstances that official investigation called accidental, but that continue to haunt observers who watch that elevator footage and feel that something more happened, something we're missing, something that the official conclusion doesn't capture, leaving Elisa Lam's death as permanent mystery, permanent tragedy, permanent case that remains unsettled despite official conclusions, that remains disturbing despite explanations, that remains the subject of speculation and discussion and endless analysis by people who watch that footage and ask what happened to Elisa Lam, why she behaved the way she did, how she ended up in that water tank, and whether the official explanation is sufficient or whether something more needs to be investigated, needs to be understood, needs to be explained before we can truly say we know what happened to Elisa Lam at the Cecil Hotel in February 2013, when she disappeared and died in circumstances that remain, after all these years, profoundly disturbing, profoundly mysterious, and profoundly tragic. The chronovisor, Vatican technology to see through time. In the archives of the Vatican, behind layers of security and classification that protect some of the world's oldest and most sensitive documents, there allegedly exists a device that represents one of the most extraordinary technological achievements in human history, if it exists at all. It's called the chronovisor, and according to claims made by a Benedictine monk named Father Pellegrino Ernetti in the 1960s, this machine can view events from the past by receiving, decoding, and reconstructing electromagnetic radiation that those events emitted, effectively turning history into something that can be witnessed rather than merely studied through artifacts and texts. Ernetti claimed to have been part of a team of scientists who built the device, claimed to have used it to witness crucifixion of Christ, to see Napoleon giving speeches, to watch performances of lost Greek plays, to observe moments from history that were previously accessible only through fragmentary accounts and conflicting testimonies. If true, the chronovisor represents technology that could revolutionize history, theology, archaeology, and our understanding of time itself. If false, if Ernetti fabricated the entire story, the question becomes why a respected religious scholar would create such an elaborate hoax, what he hoped to achieve, and whether perhaps his claims contain elements of truth wrapped in exaggeration or misdirection. Whether the chronovisor exists in some form, even if not exactly as he described it. Whether the Vatican possesses capabilities related to temporal observation that remain classified for reasons that go beyond simple technological secrecy into territory involving faith, theology, and the profound disruptions that proof of past events would create if historical and religious narratives could be verified or contradicted through direct observation. Father Pellegrino Ernetti was a respected figure, not a fringe character prone to wild claims. He was a scholar, a musician specializing in ancient music, an exorcist recognized by the church, and a person whose position and reputation would normally insulate him from accusations of fabrication or delusion. His claims about the chronovisor emerged in interviews in the 1960s and 70s, described with specificity that suggested either genuine experience or remarkably detailed imagination. He claimed the device was built in the 1950s by a team that included Enrico Fermi, the renowned physicist, and Wernher von Braun, the rocket scientist, along with other scientists whose names Ernetti provided, but whose involvement has never been verified through independent sources. The operating principle Ernetti described relies on the premise that all events emit electromagnetic radiation and sound waves that travel outward from their point of origin, and, under certain interpretations of physics, never completely dissipate, but rather become increasingly dispersed and degraded as they propagate through space. The chronovisor supposedly could locate, capture, and reconstruct these ancient radiations, bringing together the scattered photons and sound waves from historical events and reassembling them into coherent images and sounds that could be viewed and heard by operators. This would be extraordinarily sophisticated signal processing, requiring the ability to distinguish the specific radiation from a particular event from the overwhelming noise of all other radiation in the environment, to account for dispersion and interference across centuries, and to reconstruct from fragmentary data a viewable representation of what occurred. The theoretical possibility of such technology depends on interpretations of physics that aren't mainstream but aren't entirely impossible. If information is conserved in ways we don't fully understand, if the past creates imprints in space-time or in quantum fields that persist and could be accessed with sufficiently advanced sensors and processing, then something like the chronovisor might be achievable. But conventional physics suggests that electromagnetic radiation disperses according to inverse square law, meaning that signals from ancient events would be so attenuated and so mixed with cosmic background radiation and other sources that extracting usable information would be effectively impossible with any conceivable technology. Ernetti's most dramatic claim involved witnessing the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. He described the scene in detail, claimed to have witnessed the events of Good Friday, and said the experience had profound emotional and spiritual impact on him. He provided descriptions of Christ's appearance, the language spoken, details of the execution that he claimed matched historical understanding, but that he insisted came from direct observation through the chronovisor. For the Catholic Church, verification of the crucifixion through direct observation would have immense theological implications, providing physical evidence for the foundational event of Christianity, while simultaneously raising disturbing questions about whether the past should be observed, whether some events are sacred and should remain known only through faith rather than through technological voyeurism. The Vatican's response to Ernetti's claims was notably restrained. They didn't denounce him as a fraud, didn't defrock him, or censure him officially, but they also didn't confirm or acknowledge the existence of the chronovisor. This ambiguous response has fueled speculation that the Church knows more than it's saying, that perhaps the device exists, but the Church has chosen to classify and suppress it for theological and practical reasons. If historical events can be viewed directly, it would destabilize both religious certainty and historical scholarship, creating conflicts where direct observation contradicts accepted narratives, where faith becomes testable and potentially falsifiable, where every contentious historical question, from Christ's resurrection to the details of various miracles, could theoretically be investigated through temporal viewing. The photograph that Ernetti provided as evidence significantly damaged his credibility. He claimed it was an image of Christ captured through the chronovisor during the crucifixion, showing Jesus' face in profile. When researchers investigated, they discovered the image matched a postcard sold at the Sanctuary of Merciful Love in Collevalenza, Italy, showing a wooden relief sculpture. Ernetti claimed the postcard creators had copied the chronovisor image, but most concluded that Ernetti had simply photographed the relief and presented it as chronovisor output. This apparent fraud cast doubt on his entire narrative. If he faked this evidence, perhaps the entire chronovisor story was fabrication. But Ernetti never recanted his claims, even as evidence against them accumulated. On his deathbed in 1994, he maintained that the chronovisor was real, that he had indeed seen the past through it, though he allegedly told a colleague that not everything he had said about it was accurate, a cryptic admission that might mean he embellished, or might mean he had been forced to include disinformation in his public accounts to protect classified aspects of the project. The composition of the alleged team raises questions. Fermi and von Braun were both brilliant scientists with expertise in physics and engineering that could theoretically apply to exotic technology development, but both died. Fermi in 1954 and von Braun in 1977, with no public acknowledgement of involvement in temporal viewing technology. If they were involved, it would have been deeply classified work that they took to their graves. Or they were not involved, and Ernetti invoked their names to add credibility to a fabrication, knowing that the dead couldn't contradict him. The conspiracy theory that has developed around the chronovisor proposes several possibilities. Perhaps the device exists, but was found to be too dangerous or too disruptive to use or acknowledge. And Ernetti's public statements were designed to be partially discredited so that the existence of the actual technology could be hidden behind the facade of debunked claims. Perhaps it was built but didn't work as hoped, producing ambiguous images that couldn't be verified and that therefore couldn't serve any practical purpose. Perhaps it worked too well, revealing things about history and theology that powerful institutions decided must remain hidden, and Ernetti was silenced or contained, his claims dismissed as fraud to prevent further investigation. The Vatican secret archives contain countless documents and artifacts spanning 2 millennia, many of which remain classified and inaccessible to outside researchers. If the chronovisor exists, the archives would be the logical place to keep it, along with whatever records or observations the device produced. The Church's documented history of suppressing or controlling information it deems dangerous or premature for public knowledge makes it plausible that extraordinary technology could be kept secret if its existence conflicted with theological or political interests. The parallel to the Akashic records of esoteric tradition is worth noting. Various spiritual and mystical systems describe a cosmic library or field where all events and knowledge are stored and can be accessed by those with proper training or capability. The chronovisor would be the technological implementation of this concept, a device that accesses what mystical traditions claim to access through consciousness and spiritual practice. Whether these traditions are describing something real that Ernetti's team found a technological path to, or whether Ernetti was drawing on these traditions to create a plausible-sounding mechanism for his fabricated device, the conceptual overlap is significant. The ethical implications of temporal viewing technology are profound and largely unexplored in Ernetti's accounts. If the past can be viewed, questions of privacy, consent, and the sanctity of personal and historical moments become relevant. Do the dead have rights to privacy? Do sacred events lose their sacred character when they're reduced to observable phenomena? Does viewing the past change it through observer effects? Or is observation purely passive? If conflicts in historical understanding can be resolved through direct viewing, who decides what's viewed and what remains uncertain? Would religious faith survive if miracles could be verified or falsified through technological observation? The technology, if it exists, would have obvious intelligence and military applications beyond historical scholarship. Observing enemy planning in the recent past, verifying or contradicting testimony in legal proceedings, investigating unsolved crimes by viewing what actually occurred. The strategic value would be immense. This alone might justify keeping it classified, regardless of any theological concerns. A nation possessing working temporal viewing technology would have intelligence capabilities that eclipse any conventional espionage or surveillance, able to see what happened without needing infiltration or interception, limited only by the spatial resolution and temporal range of the device. The question of why Ernetti would fabricate such claims if the chronovisor doesn't exist produces various theories. Perhaps he genuinely believed in the concept and created false evidence because he couldn't build the device, but wanted to manifest the idea, believing that publicly claiming it existed might inspire actual development. Perhaps he was experimenting with memetics, with how ideas spread and persist, using the chronovisor as a thought experiment that he presented as reality to study reactions. Perhaps he had psychological or spiritual experiences that he interpreted as viewing the past and genuinely believed they were real, translating mystical or imaginal visions into a technological framework that made sense to his scientific era. Or perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between fabrication and reality. Perhaps early research into temporal viewing produced ambiguous results, unclear images, or data that might have been from the past, but might have been artifacts or noise. And Ernetti extrapolated from these preliminary results to make dramatic claims that exceeded what the technology could actually demonstrate. Perhaps he was part of research that was classified, and his public claims were cover stories or partial disclosures, mixing truth and disinformation in ways that would allow him to speak about his work while protecting its actual capabilities and status. The concept has entered popular culture and conspiracy theory as one of those persistent stories that can't be definitively disproven, because absence of evidence is an evidence of absence when dealing with allegedly classified technology. The chronovisor joins other supposed Vatican secrets. The third secret of Fatima, hidden archives containing evidence that would shake Christianity, technologies, or knowledge inherited from previous civilizations. As part of a narrative where the church possesses extraordinary information or capabilities that it keeps from the world for theological or political purposes. Whether the chronovisor exists as anything more than an idea, whether Father Ernetti witnessed the past through technology or through imagination, or through some mystical experience he misunderstood as technological. The concept endures because it addresses fundamental human desires to witness history directly, to resolve uncertainties, to see rather than to merely believe or deduce. The past is lost to us except through the fragmentary evidence it left behind. Artifacts, texts, effects that persisted. The possibility of directly observing what happened, of seeing history rather than reconstructing it, of knowing with certainty rather than probability, is powerfully appealing even as it raises troubling questions about whether some things should remain in the past, whether observation would contaminate or desecrate what it reveals, whether faith and historical interpretation serve purposes that direct knowledge would destroy. The chronovisor remains what it has been since Ernetti first described it, an unverified claim, an extraordinary assertion without extraordinary evidence, a story that could be complete fabrication or could be partial truth about technology that exists, but that remains hidden behind Vatican walls. Locked away in those secret archives where so much else that the church once contained allegedly resides. Waiting perhaps for a future where humanity is ready to face what the past would reveal. If we could see it directly, if we could point a device at history and watch it unfold before our eyes, confirming or contradicting everything we've believed based on incomplete evidence and faith-based interpretations, making history something we witness rather than something we study, turning the past from a distant abstraction into something as observable as the present. If only we had the technology, if only someone would confirm it exists, if only the Vatican would unlock its archives and reveal what Father Pellegrino Ernetti really saw or didn't see, what he really built or didn't build, whether the chronovisor is technological marvel or elaborate hoax or something in between, that's more complicated than either simple acceptance or simple dismissal can capture, leaving us, as we've always been, left with claims about Vatican secrets, wondering, speculating, unable to prove or disprove, certain only that if such technology exists, if the past can be viewed and recorded and studied directly, the institutions that possess it have chosen not to share, have chosen to keep it hidden for reasons we can only guess at, reasons that might involve protecting faith or protecting power or protecting humanity from knowledge that we're not ready to process, leaving the chronovisor as one more legend, one more rumor, one more story about technology too powerful to acknowledge, too dangerous to use, too important to destroy. Locked away where only a select few might access it, watching history unfold through a screen that bridges time itself, seeing what was, and perhaps, if the technology works in both directions as some theories propose, seeing what will be, making the Vatican not just the keeper of religious tradition, but potentially the keeper of humanity's entire timeline, past and future, visible through a device that most believe doesn't exist, but that some insist does, that Father Ernetti swore on his deathbed was real. That remains one of history's tantalizing mysteries. Did he see through time, or did he simply see what he wanted to see and convince himself it came from a device that never existed except in his imagination, giving us a legend that endures because we want it to be true, want to believe that somewhere, somehow, someone can see the past as it actually was, can witness history directly, can know with certainty what happened in moments that have vanished into time, leaving only the chronovisor claim, hovering between proven false and possibly true, a Schrodinger's device that exists and doesn't exist until someone opens the Vatican archives and shows us either the machine itself or the definitive proof that it was never anything more than one monk's remarkable imagination, one scholar's elaborate deception, or one mystic's genuine experience translated into scientific language that his era could understand, leaving the question unresolved, leaving the mystery intact, leaving us still wondering whether the Vatican can see through time and whether they've been watching history all along from their position outside it, recording, observing, knowing, while the rest of us struggle with fragments and faith and the permanent uncertainty of a past that refuses to reveal itself completely. No matter how much we dig or analyze or wish, we could simply watch what actually happened and know, finally know, what the truth is behind the legends, behind the texts, behind the centuries of history that we've reconstructed from pieces when perhaps, somewhere in Vatican City, there's a screen showing it all directly, showing the past as it was, making history into something that can be verified rather than debated. If only the chronovisor is real, if only it exists, if only Father Ernetti was telling the truth. The Dyatlov Pass incident, 9 hikers, found dead in unexplainable circumstances. In the winter of 1959, 9 experienced hikers set out into the northern Ural Mountains of what was then the Soviet Union. They were young, skilled, and well prepared for the harsh conditions they would face. Their journey was meant to be challenging but routine, a trek across the snow-covered wilderness that would test their abilities, but nothing more. What happened to them on the slopes of a mountain called Kholat Shakal, which translates to Dead Mountain in the local Mansi language, remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. The circumstances of their deaths were so bizarre, so inexplicable, that they've given rise to dozens of theories, ranging from the mundane to the absolutely extraordinary. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student with significant hiking experience. The other members were similarly qualified, university students and graduates who knew the wilderness, who understood the dangers of winter mountaineering, who had made careful preparations for their expedition. They departed from the city of Sverdlovsk, now known as Yekaterinburg, with plans to reach a mountain called Otorten and return by mid-February. One member of the group, Yuri Yudin, turned back early due to illness, a decision that almost certainly saved his life. The remaining 9 continued forward into terrain that would become their grave. When the group failed to return on schedule, search parties were eventually dispatched. What they discovered on February 26th has haunted investigators, scientists, and conspiracy theorists for decades. The tent was found on the slopes of Kholat Shakal, partially torn open, collapsed under snow. But it wasn't torn from the outside, as you might expect from an animal attack or an avalanche. The cuts were made from the inside. Someone or several people had slashed their way out of the tent in what appeared to be desperate panic. And then they had fled into the freezing night, into temperatures that would have been around negative 25 to negative 30 degrees Celsius, wearing almost nothing. Some were in their underwear. Some had only one boot. They had left behind their clothing, their supplies, everything that would have kept them alive. The bodies were found scattered across the mountainside and into the forest below, discovered over the course of several weeks. The first two were found beneath a cedar tree about 1.5 miles from the tent. They had died from hypothermia, barefoot and barely clothed. Branches on the tree had been broken up to around 15 feet high, suggesting someone had climbed it, perhaps trying to see something or escape from something. 3 more bodies, including Igor Dyatlov himself, were found between the cedar tree and the tent, positioned as though they had been trying to return to the camp. These deaths were also attributed to hypothermia. But it was the final 4 bodies, not discovered until May when the snow melted, that transformed this from a tragic hiking accident into something far stranger. These 4 were found in a ravine, and their injuries were catastrophic. 1 had major skull damage. 2 had severe chest fractures. Ribs broken with such force that one investigator compared it to the impact of a car crash. 1 woman was missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her facial tissue. The medical examiner noted that the force required to cause such chest injuries was extremely high. Yet there were no external wounds, no soft tissue damage that you would expect from a physical assault or attack by an animal. It was as though they had been subjected to some tremendous pressure, some force that crushed them from the inside without leaving marks on the surface. Even stranger, some of the clothing from these bodies was found to be radioactive, showing levels of radiation contamination that had no clear source or explanation. The official Soviet investigation concluded that the deaths were caused by what they termed a compelling natural force. This vague, almost poetic phrase explained nothing. It suggested that investigators themselves couldn't understand what had happened, or perhaps that they understood perfectly well, but couldn't or wouldn't say. The case was closed, the files sealed, and the area was declared off-limits to hikers and expeditions for the next 3 years. This official silence, this lack of clear answers, naturally gave rise to speculation and theory, to whispers about what might have really occurred on that frozen mountainside. Some have suggested that the hikers encountered a military test of some kind. The Soviet Union was deep in the Cold War, developing weapons and technologies in remote areas where accidents could be hidden and casualties explained away. The radiation found on the clothing could support this theory. Some of the hikers had previously worked in places that involved nuclear materials, which might explain low-level contamination, but the patterns didn't match residual workplace exposure. What if they had stumbled upon a weapons test? What if they had seen something they weren't supposed to see? The panic, the desperate flight from the tent, could have been a response to an approaching threat. Soldiers, perhaps, or some kind of weapon deployment that gave them only seconds to react. Others point to reports from that night of strange lights in the sky. Several groups in the area, including meteorology students at another location, and even members of the military, reported seeing bright, glowing orange spheres floating over the mountains on the night the Dyatlov group likely died. These accounts were documented, included in the official investigation, and then largely ignored. Were these lights connected to military activity? Or were they something else entirely? The theory that the hikers encountered some form of unidentified aerial phenomenon has persisted, bolstered by the unexplained nature of their injuries and the apparent panic that drove them from their shelter. What could create such terror that experienced mountaineers would rather face certain death in the cold than remain in their tent? The hypothesis of an avalanche has been examined repeatedly. In 2020, a team of scientists used modern analysis to argue that a delayed slab avalanche could explain why the tent was damaged and why the hikers fled. But this explanation struggles with several facts. The slope wasn't steep enough for typical avalanche conditions. The tent, though collapsed, wasn't buried or swept away. And most critically, an avalanche doesn't explain the severe internal injuries found on 4 of the bodies. Injuries that occurred hours after they left the tent, when they were already far down the mountain in the ravine. An avalanche also doesn't explain the missing soft tissue, the radiation, or why they would cut their way out of the tent rather than simply exit through the entrance. There are theories involving infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that can be generated by wind passing over certain terrain formations. These waves, though inaudible, can cause feelings of extreme anxiety, panic, and even physical symptoms like chest pressure and disorientation. Could the unique geography of Kholat Shakal have created an infrasound event that drove the hikers into an irrational panic? The theory is intriguing because it explains the seemingly irrational behavior, the flight from safety into lethal cold, without requiring external attackers or supernatural elements. Yet it doesn't explain the physical trauma, the broken ribs and crushed skulls, or the missing tissue and eyes. Some have suggested a violent confrontation with the indigenous Mansi people, but this theory holds little water. The Mansi had no history of violence toward hikers or outsiders, and investigators at the time explicitly ruled out human involvement in the deaths. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks from other people, no evidence of weapons or assault. The Mansi themselves considered the mountain a sacred place, a place of the dead, and avoided it. They had names for it that spoke of danger and spirits, passed down through generations. Whether this represented ancestral knowledge of real hazards, unstable terrain, unusual weather patterns, dangerous wildlife, or something else entirely, remains an open question. The presence of radioactive contamination has led some to wonder about exposure to materials from Soviet nuclear activities. The area, though remote, was not impossibly far from facilities where nuclear research and weapons development occurred. Could the hikers have been exposed to contamination before their trip, or could they have encountered something on the mountain itself? The patterns of contamination weren't consistent across all the bodies or all pieces of clothing, which suggests localized exposure rather than general environmental contamination. Some pieces of clothing showed readings, others did not. If they had encountered a crashed or damaged device containing radioactive materials, it might explain both the contamination and the panic, but no such device was ever found, and no reports of missing materials have come to light. Then there are the more unusual theories, the ones that venture into territory most investigators refuse to consider. The strange lights, the inexplicable injuries, the radiation, the apparent panic. Could these be signs of an encounter with something not of this world? The idea that the Dyatlov group witnessed or was attacked by something extraterrestrial or interdimensional has been proposed by those who find conventional explanations insufficient. The missing eyes and tongue, removed with what seemed like precision, rather than torn by scavengers, have been cited as evidence of something beyond natural predation. The lack of external wounds, despite massive internal trauma, suggests technology or force beyond what could be produced by avalanche, animal, or human attacker. These theories remain speculative, built on the gaps in our understanding, rather than direct evidence, yet they persist because those gaps are so large, so troubling. What makes the Dyatlov Pass incident so compelling, so resistant to closure, is the combination of documented facts that refuse to form a coherent picture. We know these people existed. We know they died. We have photographs they took showing them setting up camp, smiling and relaxed just hours before whatever happened occurred. We have the physical evidence, the tent, The bodies, the clothing, the autopsy reports. We have witness statements about lights in the sky. We have radiation readings and injury descriptions from official Soviet documents. These are not rumors or folklore. They are facts. And yet they don't add up to an explanation that satisfies all the evidence. Some researchers have suggested that multiple factors combined. That perhaps the hikers were driven from their tent by one threat, an infrasound event, or the approach of something they feared, and then encountered a second danger that caused the traumatic injuries. This layered explanation accounts for the different types of evidence, but requires accepting that this group experienced an extraordinarily unlikely series of misfortunes. Others believe the answer is simpler, that we're missing one key piece of information that would make everything clear, some detail that was lost or deliberately omitted from the investigation. The families of the victims spent decades seeking answers, pushing for reinvestigations, refusing to accept the vague conclusions offered by authorities. In 2019, 60 years after the incident, Russian authorities reopened the case. Their conclusion, announced in 2020, favored the avalanche theory. Yet even this modern investigation acknowledged puzzling aspects of the case that don't fit neatly into any single explanation. The lack of avalanche debris, the specific pattern of injuries, the cut tent. These elements continue to resist simple categorization. What happened on the slopes of Dead Mountain remains, in many ways, unknowable. 9 people fled their shelter in the middle of a frozen night, choosing almost certain death over remaining where they were. Some force, some threat, real or perceived, drove them into conditions that would kill them within hours, if not minutes. 4 of them sustained injuries so severe that hypothermia wasn't even the cause of death. Injuries that seemed to come from massive force applied without external wounds. Something occurred on that mountain that we still cannot fully explain, something that transformed a routine expedition into a nightmare that has echoed through decades. The theories continue to evolve, shaped by new technologies, new understanding of natural phenomena, new information that occasionally emerges from old Soviet files. Each explanation illuminates part of the mystery while leaving other parts in shadow. Perhaps that's why the Dyatlov Pass incident endures in our collective imagination, why it continues to generate discussion and debate. It sits at the intersection of the known and the unknown, a documented event that defies documentation, a tragedy with facts, but no satisfactory narrative to connect them. The mountain keeps its secrets, and the 9 who died, they're left behind more questions than answers, more mystery than resolution. The Mandela effect. Are we shifting between parallel realities? Thousands of people remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s. They remember the news coverage, the funeral, the global mourning for the anti-apartheid leader who never made it out of captivity to become South Africa's president. They remember it vividly, with specific details about where they were when they heard the news, how they felt, what the television reports showed. Except Nelson Mandela didn't die in prison. He was released in 1990, became president in 1994, and died in 2013 at age 95. The memories are completely, objectively wrong. But they're not isolated cases of poor recall. They're shared by enough people that the phenomenon has a name, coined by paranormal researcher Fiona Broom, who discovered at a conference that she wasn't alone in her false memory, that others remembered the same incorrect version of history. This is the Mandela effect, and it extends far beyond one man's death to encompass hundreds of specific, detailed memories that large groups of people share, despite those memories contradicting documented reality. The explanations range from simple psychology, memory is fallible, and people confuse similar events, to something far more disturbing. We're not remembering incorrectly, we're remembering accurately, but we're remembering a different timeline, a parallel reality we used to inhabit, before something shifted us into this one where details are slightly different, where the past has been subtly rewritten, where we're living in a world that doesn't quite match the one we were born into. The examples are numerous and unsettlingly specific. The children's book series is Berenstain Bears with an A, but massive numbers of people remember it as Berenstein with an E, can picture the cover with that spelling, have visceral certainty they read Berenstein, even though every physical copy that exists says Berenstain. The evil queen in Snow White doesn't say mirror, mirror on the wall. She says magic mirror on the wall. But the phrase everyone remembers is mirror, mirror, and they'll swear they heard it in the Disney film, even though watching the actual film proves they're wrong. Darth Vader never says, "Luke, I am your father." The actual line is, "No, I am your father." But the misquoted version is what millions remember as one of cinema's most iconic moments. The Monopoly Man doesn't have a monocle, has never had a monocle, but people clearly remember him wearing one, can visualize it with perfect clarity. These aren't vague recollections, but specific memories that feel absolutely certain, yet documentation shows they're false. The psychological explanation is well established. Human memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive, meaning we don't store perfect recordings of events, but rather reconstruct them from fragments when we recall them. This process is vulnerable to contamination from other sources, from expectations, from cultural transmission of information that wasn't in the original experience. We remember the Monopoly Man with a monocle because he resembles Mr. Peanut, who does have a monocle, and our brains conflate the two wealthy mascots. We remember Luke, I am your father, because that's how the line is always referenced in parodies and discussions. And the cultural version overwrites our actual memory of the film. We remember Berenstein because names ending in Stein are more common than Stain, so our pattern recognition systems default to the more familiar spelling. But this explanation struggles when you examine the specificity and confidence of false memories, particularly when thousands of people remember not just similar details, but identical details that are wrong in the same specific ways. The Berenstain Bears isn't just remembered incorrectly. It's remembered as Berenstein by people who grew up with the books, who read them hundreds of times, whose parents read them aloud nightly. These aren't casual misrememberings, but detailed recollections from childhood that feel completely authentic. The certainty is what unsettles. People don't remember Berenstein as a possibility or a maybe. They remember it with absolute conviction, can picture the cover, the spine, the way the letters looked, and when confronted with physical evidence that they're wrong, the cognitive dissonance is profound and disturbing. The parallel reality explanation suggests that reality isn't singular, but consists of multiple timelines or dimensions existing simultaneously, and that under certain conditions, possibly related to quantum mechanics, consciousness, or events like the activation of the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, these realities can merge, or people can shift between them. In your original timeline, it was Berenstain Bears, and Nelson Mandela died in prison, and the Monopoly Man had a monocle. But something happened, some cosmic event, or quantum fluctuation, or deliberate experiment that moved you into this timeline where those details are different. You remember the other reality because you actually experienced it. Your memories are accurate for the world you came from, but you're now in a world where the past is slightly different, and everyone who was always here thinks you're crazy for remembering things that never happened here. This theory gains traction from the observation that Mandela effects seem to have increased in frequency, or at least in awareness, since roughly 2008 to 2012, which coincides with CERN activating the Large Hadron Collider and conducting experiments that involve smashing particles at energies that create conditions similar to moments after the Big Bang. if those experiments are doing something to the structure of space-time or reality, if they're creating quantum effects that ripple outward and affect larger systems, then perhaps they're also causing timeline instabilities or mergers. Every time they run the collider, maybe realities blur slightly. Maybe people slip between versions of history. Maybe the past becomes fluid in ways that leave those of us who notice feeling displaced and gaslit by a world that insists our memories are wrong when we know they're right. Quantum mechanics provides theoretical framework that makes parallel realities plausible. The many worlds interpretation suggests that every quantum event creates branching timelines, that all possible outcomes actually occur, but in separate universes that split off from each other. In one branch, someone decided to spell the bear's name with an E. In another branch, with an A. In one branch, Mandela died in the 80s. In another, he was released and became president. These branches exist simultaneously, and if the barriers between them are permeable or can be crossed under certain conditions, then people might experience memories from multiple timelines, might carry recollections from branches they no longer inhabit. The experience of discovering you're subject to a Mandela effect is genuinely disorienting. You know what you remember. You can access the memory with clarity and detail. It feels as authentic as any other memory you possess. Then someone shows you physical evidence that contradicts your memory. The book cover that's spelled differently. The movie clip where the line is different. The Monopoly box where the man has no monocle. And reality tilts. Either your memory is catastrophically unreliable, worse than you ever imagined, and calling into question everything you think you know about your own past, or something impossible has occurred. Reality has changed, and you're one of the few people who notice because you remember how it used to be. Some Mandela effects involve geography. People remember New Zealand being in a different position relative to Australia, or South America being more directly under North America, rather than offset to the east, or countries having different shapes or sizes than they currently do. These geographic memories are particularly disturbing because maps are reference materials people consult repeatedly throughout education. If you looked at maps hundreds of times and consistently saw New Zealand in a certain position, and now maps show it somewhere else, either your spatial memory is completely non-functional or the maps have changed. And if maps have changed, then either cartographers got it wrong for decades and suddenly corrected it everywhere simultaneously, or the actual position of land masses has shifted between timelines. There are also anatomical Mandela effects. People remember human hearts being on the left side of the chest when anatomy shows it's more center left than fully left. They remember ribs protecting organs that are actually below the rib cage. They remember organs in different positions or different sizes than current medical diagrams show. These are harder to dismiss as simple misremembering because many people studied anatomy in school, have looked at diagrams, have pressed their hands to their chests to feel their heartbeat, and formed spatial memories based on where they felt it. If those memories are uniformly wrong in specific ways across thousands of people, it suggests something beyond individual error. Corporate logos are frequent sources of Mandela effects. People remember the Fruit of the Loom logo having a cornucopia despite the company insisting it never existed. They remember Chick-fil-A, spelled as Chick-fil-A or Chick-fil-A. They remember Kit Kat having a hyphen when it's actually Kit Kat with no punctuation. Ford's logo includes a curly tail on the F that many people don't remember being there. Volkswagen's logo has a line separating the V and W that massive numbers of people swear wasn't there before. These aren't obscure brands, but companies whose logos people have seen thousands of times, and yet collective memory differs from current physical reality. Film and television quotes are especially prone to Mandela effects. "Hello, Clarice" is never said in Silence of the Lambs. The actual greeting is "Good morning." Play it again. Sam is never said in Casablanca. The actual line is, "Play it, Sam." Forrest Gump says, "Life was like a box of chocolates," not "life is like a box of chocolates," using past tense that most people misremember as present. The cumulative weight of these misremembered quotes across millions of people suggests either that human memory for media is astoundingly unreliable, or that we're remembering versions of these films that existed in timelines we used to inhabit before shifting to this one. Religious texts have reported Mandela effects that disturb believers who've studied scripture extensively. People remember, "The lion shall lie down with the lamb," as a biblical passage when the actual text says, "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb." They remember specific verses being worded differently, positioned in different books, or not existing at all despite clear memories of reading and discussing them. For individuals who've dedicated their lives to scriptural study, discovering that passages they memorized are different from what appears in current Bibles creates profound theological and psychological crisis. The question of why some people experience Mandela effects while others don't adds another layer of mystery. If reality actually shifted, why do only some people remember the previous version? Possible explanations include consciousness differences. Perhaps certain individuals are more sensitive to dimensional shifts, more aware when changes occur, less likely to have their memories automatically overwritten when timelines merge. Or perhaps everyone experiences the shift, but most people's brains automatically update to match the new reality, while a minority retain memories from the previous timeline due to neurological or consciousness differences that make them resistant to the update. There's also the possibility that Mandela effects are deliberate, that someone or something is intentionally editing reality, and these residual memories in a subset of the population are evidence of the editing process. Why would reality be edited? To change historical outcomes, to eliminate or create specific events, to test whether humans notice when their past is altered, or to fine-tune conditions toward a desired future. If you had technology or capability to modify timeline, you'd probably start with small changes. Brand spellings, minor geographic details, trivial quotes from films, to test whether the changes hold and whether anyone notices. The Mandela effects we're aware of might be the test runs, minor alterations that don't significantly impact history, but do reveal whether the editing process is detectable. Some researchers connect Mandela effects to CERN specifically, noting that the collider's location near Geneva, Switzerland, places it in proximity to where many Mandela effects seem to be noticed first or most strongly. CERN's logo includes what conspiracy theorists interpret as 666, and the statue of Shiva, the Hindu god of destruction, at their facility has been cited as evidence they're intentionally opening portals or destroying and recreating reality. CERN scientists dismiss this as absurd misunderstanding of particle physics. But the timing correlation between LHC activations and increased reports of Mandela effects continues to fuel speculation about connection. The psychological toll of experiencing Mandela effects is significant. When your memories conflict with physical evidence and consensus reality, you face three possibilities. You're mentally ill and experiencing false memories. Everyone else is wrong and you're right. Or reality itself is unstable. None of these are comfortable. Many people experiencing Mandela effects report feeling gaslit by the universe, questioning their sanity, becoming obsessed with documenting other potential changes, living in constant uncertainty about whether reality will shift again and what will be different next time. Online communities provide validation where people who remember the same incorrect versions of reality gather to confirm each other's memories and track new potential shifts. But this can also deepen the obsession and isolation from consensus reality. Skeptics point out that many Mandela effects can be explained through straightforward cognitive psychology. Memory is imperfect. People confuse similar things. Cultural transmission distorts information. Expectations shape recall. The fact that people make similar mistakes doesn't require parallel realities, just similar cognitive processes making similar errors under similar conditions. The spelling Berenstein looks more natural than Berenstain to English speakers, so we misremember it toward the familiar pattern. Mirror mirror sounds more poetic and repetitive than magic mirror, so we remember the better phrase rather than the actual phrase. These are features of how memory works, not evidence of dimensional shifts. But for those experiencing Mandela effects, these explanations feel insufficient. The memories are too vivid, too detailed, too specific. They're not vague impressions, but clear recollections with sensory detail, emotional content, contextual information. You don't just vaguely think it was Berenstein. You can see the book cover on your childhood shelf, remember your parents' voice saying the name, recall your young mind sounding out the letters. That level of constructed false memory for trivial details about children's books and brand logos, experienced by thousands of people in identical ways, seems to require more than just normal memory fallibility. There's also the meta question. If memory is as unreliable as the skeptical explanation requires, if we routinely fabricate detailed false memories for no apparent reason, and with such consistency that thousands of us remember identical false details, then what else that we remember might be false? If you can't trust your memory about whether the Monopoly Man had a monocle, or how a beloved childhood book series was spelled, can you trust your memories of your childhood, your relationships, your identity? The Mandela effect, if it's purely psychological, reveals that human memory is far more fictional than we'd like to believe. If it's reality shifting, it reveals that the universe is far less stable than we assume. Either way, the implications for certainty and identity are disturbing. What makes the phenomenon particularly fascinating and frustrating is that it's unfalsifiable. There's no test that can distinguish between everyone is misremembering and reality shifted, but most people's memories updated to match the new timeline. If reality editing were perfect, we wouldn't notice at all. The fact that we notice through Mandela effects might be evidence that the editing is imperfect, that some people slip through the update process with memories intact from the previous version. Or it might be evidence that human memory is unreliable in surprisingly consistent ways. We have no method to determine which explanation is correct because both predict exactly the same observational evidence. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is the feeling that accompanies discovering you're subject to a Mandela effect. It's not just confusion or surprise. Many people describe it as visceral wrongness, as if reality has been violated, as if they're seeing evidence that the world isn't what it pretends to be. There's a sense of betrayal, of having the ground pulled out from under your epistemological foundation. If you can't trust physical evidence because it contradicts your clear memories, and you can't trust your memories because physical evidence contradicts them, what can you trust? You're left suspended between certainty that what you remember is real and evidence that it never existed, living in a kind of existential uncertainty where the past is negotiable and your mind might be carrying memories from a reality that no longer exists or never existed here. The Mandela Effect communities online document hundreds of potential examples, some more convincing than others, tracking reports of new discrepancies as people notice them. Members report feelings of displacement, of not quite belonging in this version of reality, of noticing small things that seem wrong in ways they can't articulate. They compare notes on what they remember versus what currently exists, finding comfort in shared false memories that confirm they're not alone in their experiences. But there's also paranoia. If reality can shift, how do you know it won't shift again? If the past can change, might it change in ways that erase you or people you love? The universe becomes fundamentally untrustworthy, capable of editing itself and gaslighting everyone about what used to be real. Whether the Mandela effect represents fallible human memory, producing consistent errors through shared cognitive biases, or whether it's evidence that we're living in a quantum multiverse where timelines occasionally merge or people shift between parallel realities, or whether it's proof that someone or something is actively editing reality and we're the few who notice because our memories didn't update properly. The phenomenon persists and grows. More people discover discrepancies between their memories and current reality. More examples accumulate. More individuals experience the disorienting realization that what they remember with absolute certainty never happened. At least not here. Not in this timeline. Not in this version of the world. And we're left wondering whether we're remembering wrong or remembering right from somewhere else. Whether we were born in this reality or slipped into it from another. Whether the past is fixed and our minds are broken, or whether the past is fluid and we're among the few who retain memory of what it used to be before it changed into what it is now, leaving us displaced persons from timelines that no longer exist except in memories that everyone insists are false. Despite feeling more real than anything we've experienced since the day we realized that reality doesn't quite match what we remember, that we're living in a world that's subtly wrong in ways we can document but never prove, carrying memories from a past that this world claims never happened.